So I'll use that context. But specifically, what we're looking at is shifting our pedagogy, and by pedagogy, I mean our approach to teaching, the underlying principles and philosophies that inform our teaching. Right? So a lot of times when we look at these bridges and barriers, they're about the outcomes of the teaching. We want exposure, so we want to expose students. They're about representation. We want students to be present, people with different identities and abilities. But behind the scenes of all of that, or the underlying foundations, is our philosophies about how to best achieve that, or what those ends will do. And so a lot of my work is about bringing more attention to what type of perspectives, beliefs, ideas, and ideologies inform the way that we approach our teaching and how learning occurs. And so I'll talk about shifting our pedagogy towards epistemic inclusion. And sorry if the background is difficult throughout today. I'll try to read slowly and clearly, but if you can't see anything, if you have questions about the words I'm using, please ask questions at the end so I get lost. But please ask questions if there's words that you was like, we understand that, or can you clarify further? But epistemic, right? So of course I tried to highlight the STEM. We're talking about STEM inclusion, but epistemic is largely about what? What is epistemic connected to? Anybody? Somebody? Everybody? Say it out. Knowledge.
Sounds a lot like an epidemic.
Similar to epidemic, right? But more so the key part there is episteme, knowledge. So we're talking about STEM education, but who defines what science education is? And what is science education defined as? What is technology education defined as? What is the knowledge that undergirds what these things mean? Oftentimes, it's kind of like, I know Megan works in the inclusion space, or really DEI. A lot of times people get these acronyms. We like to use acronyms, and we lose the richness of the individual words, or even differentiation, because we use them so much as an acronym. So what really is science knowledge? What is technological knowledge? What is engineering knowledge? What is mathematical knowledge? How are they similar, but also how are they different? How do they work together? So this is really we're going to talk. I'm not going to define those things for you, but I think they're important to focus on. So a couple things I'm going to go through. So the first section entitled "Miss Me with That." Fill in the blank. Right? How many people are saying you miss me with that? Miss me with that. What is that generally referring to? Somebody that I like crowd participation. Please talk back to me.
I don't want to hear it.
I don't want to hear it. Okay, that's a different interpretation. Anybody else?
Yes.
Haven't heard that one.
It doesn't apply to me.
Doesn't apply to me. Yeah. Anybody else? Don't know what you're talking about. So that's generally how I understand, right? So of course with words we have different uses, but generally it's like, I don't even know what you're talking about. You miss me with that, blah, 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 blah. And so we're going to talk about how our STEM educators, or how STEM educators are talking at cross purposes in our blending. So that's the first section I'll talk about. Then I'll talk about if you know, you know. Anybody heard that before? Now it's popular IYK, YK. What's that about? Self-explanatory. Thank you. All right, so problematizing the underlying epistemologies of U.S. STEM education. Right, so there's this, and when people heard this, I did like the hidden curriculum. Right, so with that, Jimmy talks about there's a lot that's not explicitly stated that folks learn how to situate themselves in academic context, or just in general. Right, so Megan talked about the guidelines of how we're going to interact today. But there may be some other things, right? Like when you come into class, what are you all doing? Sitting down. No one told you to sit down, but there are chairs, and you generally, there's chairs, and you focus towards me. So what are the unstated norms around knowledge in the classroom, right? So a lot of times with our students, there's a lot going on where they're getting excluded. We're not even naming the mechanisms that exclude them, but they know them. And if you know, you know. And that's how you orient yourself. So we need to problematize that. And then thirdly, make it make sense. How many people heard that one? All right, I'm going to come. Danny, what's that about?
Well, make it make sense. Help me understand.
Help me understand, right? This is not making sense to me. And so we're going to talk about using non-white ways of knowing. So ways of knowing is a different way of saying epistemology to foster STEM comprehension. So again, we talk a lot about representation, exposure, but how do we know when students are actually grasping these things? How are they actually learning things? And how can we change the ways in which we try to connect with them? So first, talking at cross purposes. So it can be defined generally to talk with others in a way that causes continued conflict, opposition, or misunderstanding within a pair or group of people. So you have a dynamic where people, anybody been in a situation where you all are exchanging words, but you're not getting deeper understanding. Right? You're talking about one thing, they're talking about something else. And so it's not a simple misunderstanding, but it causes a conflict. Right? So this is more antagonistic. It's not simply like, oh, let's get someone else to kind of interpret or mediate, or to clarify. Our misunderstanding is actually causing tension between us. That's this idea of talking at cross purposes. Here, it can also say, like, talking to each other in a way that causes confusion or failure because people are working or talking with different goals or purposes. All right, so again, the first point is describing people are having a conversation, they're in the same space, in the same context, but not understanding each other, and there's a tension arising. But the second part is saying that's happening because people are working and talking with different goals. Right, so there can be many different reasons why people are having misunderstandings. But today we're going to talk about when the root cause of that misunderstanding is different goals or purposes. How can we have different purposes in STEM education? Is it possible that the educators, the teachers, may have different perspectives and goals than administrators and the curriculum developers? Is it possible? Yeah, maybe. Of course it is possible. Is it happening? Yeah. Right? Now, what is the implication when there's a difference in goals between the educator and the student? Now we're having dynamics in the classroom of conflict, opposition, misunderstanding. And what the research shows is when that is a racial dynamic, non-white students lose out. They are penalized. Right? They're pushed out. They are deemed inadequate. So these things are very consequential. So let's look at some of these different goals and purposes. So typically what I have on the, I'll just go through each of these. So, and I have sources that I can share these slides. I have the sources, so I'm not just talking out the side of my neck, or you don't have to just take my word for it. These things come from researchers and scholars. But often STEM is very individualistic. By individualistic, meaning focusing on individual identity, independence, self-fulfillment, and standing out. Right? Working hard so you can be the preeminent scholar, or you want to be excellent or great. And that in itself is not necessarily problematic. But the consequence of that is it causes a competitive dynamic. Well, that's going to be a problem if your students come from a cultural context that emphasizes collectivism or sociocentric. If their home context, their communal context, or their ethnic origins are rooted in focusing on group identity and interdependence, social responsibility and fitting in. That social responsibility part is key, because here it's not simply about, oh, we like to work together, or it's easier, right? I have to do less work when we're together. No, it's about underlying principles and values of I'm better when I'm good when you good, right? Or I'm not good, so all of us is good. Anybody heard those type of ideologies or ethos, right? Those things are real. That's ways that people make sense of the world. We're talking about knowledge. How do we make sense of our world and our existence? A lot of different cultures, particularly indigenous, black or Afrocentric, are rooted, and also Latinx, right? Very interdependent. You can see this in family norms, right? There are certain cultures that you don't send your grandparents to a house, a home or something like that, right? You keep them in the house because you take care of your family, right? You realize that they took care of you, so then you would pay that back, right there. And so again, this is not just, I'm not trying to get at right, wrong, better, or worse. This is just the reality that we're in the classroom and we're not all here with the same goals and intentionalities or desires. But a lot of times in STEM education, we're streamlining or assuming that whatever the mainstream idea is, everybody else is on board. And that's where we're having a lot of tension. And students are enacting their own individual agency by not participating. Right? So this is, in general, again, what's the purpose of all this? To say, in these out-of-school experiences, how can you all make space to bring in this epistemic inclusion, to bring in other ways of engaging and knowing. So continuing, some folks argue that school is essential. And I'm specifically using school and not education here, because I think education is much broader than schooling. Schooling has its own norms and cultures and practices that can also often be detrimental to learning and knowledge, right? So some people say, you gotta go to school, right? Why wouldn't you go to school? School is a great place. It's where you learn. It's where you learn to become better, blah, 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 blah. Well, for some folks, school is an obligation. They don't feel as if they're actually learning. I'm talking about youth here. They can tell you, we don't learn that in school. These guys doing these worksheets. Or the teacher not really talking to us, they talking to the whiteboard. Or the smart screen, especially in 2023. Right? They're not really talking to me and what I have to deal with when I leave the school, before I come to this school. So I just go there because I have to, because it's the law. And so again, we have differing ideals of what that space means, even though we're in the same space. How does that influence learning and participation? STEM. A lot of times, so I studied mechanical engineering, and when I used to tell people that I studied as an undergrad, two things they'll say: "Oh, you're smart." Somehow engineers are assumed to be smart. I don't know where that came from. But second, they say you're gonna make a lot of money. And so when I didn't feel really connected to engineering content, I stayed, because how could I argue with that? People assumed I was smart, and they told me I would make a lot of money. Coming from a single-parent home, out of lower to middle class, Detroit, Michigan background, I want to make some money. You know what I mean? So I struggled to see what else. Those are the messages I was getting. Well, a lot of times we're talking about STEM, it's about, well, there's so many STEM jobs. There's some of the high-paying jobs. And so we use it as a motivator, not realizing that everyone is not moved by that. In fact, when we're talking about, again, non-white, racially minoritized students, they're actually moved more by communal impact. Now, let me be clear. My goal is not to say, hey, pick these up and use this to persuade students to do STEM. Right? That's what sometimes we do. Like, oh, what do those students like? What do black students like? Let me do that. All right, now you use it as a promotional avenue to recruit students. I'm not sitting and using it in that superficial way. I'm more so trying to say we need to reckon what this means for our learning experiences. Right? So if a student is more focused on community impact, right, or potential for impact more broadly, maybe it's not in their respective community, but just what is this going to cause me to do? Then we have to be more sensitive that money is not the driving factor for everyone. It may be important, there may not be we talk about anti-capitalism, they may not be that, but just making space for different priorities and how we present information. And then lastly, a lot of times we talk about engineers, and I know I would talk about engineering a lot, and I talk about black people, because that's the space that I know. But if you think broadly around other, non-white groups and even STEM more broadly, right? Engineering oftentimes talking about problem solvers. What is engineering? It's about solving problems. That always baffles me. I'm like, there's a lot of different people that solve problems, but somehow that's the definition for engineering. And it's very broad, right? But if we dig in, those problems are typically seen as technical problems, right? So how do we design a strong and sturdy desk or a comfortable chair? Not necessarily how do we restore a disenfranchised community. Are there no engineering concerns in that? Are there not? Are there any engineering concerns? My bad, that's not rhetorical.
Yes, there are concerns.
Yeah, are there engineering concerns in the social political dynamics of disenfranchised communities?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. Right. So, why do we only emphasize technological problems? I teach a course right now, mechanical engineering and racial justice. A student in biomedical engineering wanted to petition for the class to be included on their list of courses, but it was 5 faculty, 3 out of 5 voted that it's not engineering enough, right? And so we can again get into the detail of that, but the problem is we're losing students a lot of times because they want to use technical knowledge to solve social issues. And we use that as a draw, but we don't see that as the underlying aspect of what it means to know and do STEM. Even though engineering is inherently socio-technical, you really cannot separate those. You can de-emphasize the social, but whatever you do will have a social impact, right? And so nowadays we're trying to advocate, say, well, we need to bring back the social. The social never left. It's always been there. It's been neglected and ignored. So how does that influence our epistemic understanding of what STEM and engineering is. And so what is the outcome of all of this? There's a connection between communal goals and feelings of belonging, low motivation, and perceived poor academic performance. This is what the literature says, these ideas of lack of belonging, low motivation, poor academic performance. Those are the reasons that the research is saying that black, brown, other students are not participating in STEM, are not becoming professional STEMers, right? And what I'm saying here, or what this paper said, this one at the bottom is saying that this is connected to these different goals. We're teaching at cross purposes. That's why these things are showing up. It's not that they're not true. Are you going to be motivated to do something that you're going to find fulfillment in? Many of us, if we're honest, some of us do, right? We're not necessarily motivated, but we got to get this done. Our older generation is like, it's about getting it done. Forget that passion stuff, right? Some of us come from that context. But nowadays, and for many years, the students have been rejecting that. I want to do something I feel a greater connection to, or something I'm more excited about, or I know that I can make an impact. I hear that a lot from students. I just want to make an impact. And so a lot of this STEM exclusion has to do with the underlying ways that STEM is presented. Okay, so if you know, you know. What are the things that are assumed to be known, or how we make sense of knowledge in STEM education? So epistemology is a Greek word I use a lot to center my research, and this is a very simplistic description of what that means. The theory of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, validity, and scope, meaning what methods do people engage in to determine that something is true. For example, if you say something, do I believe you? So it's one way, or it's one method, just communicating. Is it experimentation? How do we validate what someone said? Somebody would have told me something, I may or may not believe it. So I might go ask someone else. That's a measure of validation, right? So I can say I believe people when they tell me something. I can say, no, I need to check this out. So I'll go somewhere else and get validation from a third person or a third entity. Or I might just sit back and wait and watch and observe for a while. These are methods of validation of knowledge. And then scope is about how broad that knowledge extends. Is that just true for you, or is it true for all of us? All right, so epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. I think that terminology is real interesting because it doesn't say truth. It says justified belief. While we make sense of things in that way, but how do we really know that it's true? It's because Dr. Pollack keeps saying it to me. It's because Dr. Pollack wrote a book about it. Or Dr. Pollack has been supported by certain people who have authority. Or Dr. Pollack has the power to put it in our books, and so therefore it's true. Right? We need to be honest with our students that a lot of we're all human beings. We're all flawed. We all have a limited lifespan. So none of us have been along. We're passing stories and information along throughout it. So a lot of it may be justified, right? But whereas opinion, some people say everybody has one of those, but how do we differentiate when someone's just giving their perspective? And that gets into like expertise, right? So again, a lot of this, I actually, I think the first guideline you had for the session was that, or for the workshop is that presenters give you all something tangible. I didn't see that one. So we just doing a lot of thinking today.
I went to workshops.
I'm just messing. I'm just being funny, right? So we just gonna do a lot of hard thinking this time, and hopefully it stimulates your mind to get the juices flowing for everybody else to come back, to build on it. But my point is, it's like this dynamic of opinion. When we think about expertise, whose opinion matters more, right? How do we, determine expertise? These are things that, when we're going to try to address these barriers and build these bridges, again, oftentimes they're hidden. And so I'm arguing that as we try to do those things, we also need to think about these hidden dynamics, because I will argue that they're very influential to the other things. So I'll go through this a little bit. So there's different aspects, dimensions to epistemology or episteme. So first is epistemic access. Knowing versus not knowing, type of evidence, modes of access. And so it says like degree of certainty grounded in experience or evidence, it's saying who is able to contribute to knowledge in what ways. Okay? So we're talking about grounded in experience or evidence. In some cases, someone did something and they did it again and they did it again. And so, again, is that evidence verbal or is it experimentation? In science, what is often the way that we make sense and determine evidence? In science. Experimentation, say it.
Experimentation and observation.
Experimentation, observation. Somebody said something else?
Data.
Data from the experimentations and observation. Yep. Right, so that's the way that generally it is made sense. Is that the only way to make sense of things? Right, generally not. But what that does is when that becomes the determination, now we move into epistemic authority. Experimentation has been given authority as one of the greatest ways to determine truth. So experimentation in general, just to remind us, is like we're going to do something, we're going to have a hypothesis, we're going to try it out. And I'm using these very broad terms because it's not always like just being in a traditional lab, right? The scientific method is also like social research and things like that too. But in general, you're making a hypothesis about something, you have some problem, you determine what might happen, so you try it out. You have your controls, right, your different variables, and then you get some results, and you say, okay, I'm going to try this again. And so you repeat that process, and so over the course of time, after you have so much data, then you make a theory around that, right? Or you synthesize what that means based on all that data. It's a reasonable way to know things, right? It makes sense. What I argue is when we get to this epistemic authority, it's been deemed as the best way. In some cases, it's been deemed as the only real way. Right? And so these alternative epistemic ways of knowing are devalued and illegitimized in our STEM classrooms. Right? So testimony, things like that. So epistemic authority is right here, authority of knowledge. How do we know this is trustworthy? What is determination? What gives power to this way of knowing? And then lastly, epistemic responsibility. So the obligations to rights to have information. So who can be knowers? If we look in our STEM resources and materials, what do the identities tend to be of the knowers and the folks that we get our information from? Who do they tend to be? Say it again. White people. Males. Media. Right? So generally, epistemic responsibility is placed upon generally white males, as the determinant. Those folks are the ones that are more trustworthy to have epistemic authority and determine what we know and how we get to know information. Right? So again, when we talk about epistemology, it's a fancy word, it may get confusing, but in general, it's the idea of who can contribute, whose knowledge do we trust? What practices do we determine what is real, what is worthy of trusting? So, we can pause for a second and ask these questions. These are questions to think about as you're designing your experiences, as you're providing educational opportunities, whether in the formal classroom or in the out-of-school experiences, where I argue there's more flexibility. All right, so what I saw, when I started my PhD, I got into it because I wanted to change the way that black students were taught about engineering in out-of-school programs, like the Saturday school sessions or Saturday learning sessions or after school. And one of the things I liked about it so much is I had a lot of flexibility in what I could do. I didn't have to respond to the traditional, standards or things like that. Now, it's a blessing and a curse, right? Because you could also be doing something that doesn't really have any usefulness for students later on, right? They might have fun, but the question is, are they learning anything that will be useful for their academic involvement later on? So it's a balance that you have to strike. But what I'm seeing now in a lot of research is, particularly in engineering education as it expands, are people trying to use the out-of-school spaces to make up for what's missing, or they're trying to use out-of-school spaces to extend what happens in in-school spaces. So instead of filling the gaps or even expanding upon it, people are replicating in-school practices in out-of-school spaces. And I think that's deeply problematic, right? And so you have a flexibility in time and venue and mode and method. And so all those things I encourage us to think about, are we providing epistemic access for marginalized students? Specifically, I'm talking about racially marginalized, but this applies to any students who are not regularly community supported in the traditional academic space. And again, going back here, academic, are we giving them space to give alternative presentations of what it means to know something, right? So this is an example. One of the primary ways that we assess knowledge in academic space, particularly in STEM, is standardized tests or time testing. Right? Providing epistemic access could mean we're doing something more orally grounded. Right? Allowing students to demonstrate what they know by verbally expressing it or by demonstrating. Now again, these things don't have to be complex. Right? So I'm not saying you have to create some oral exam, but it means asking, instead of saying, hey, at the end of this period, we're going to do a survey or exam, I'm going to just ask you some questions, and we're going to dialogue for me to unpack how much you really understand about this concept or principle. Right? Or we're going to do, this is what a lot of capstone projects and things like that are growing, because students have to make something or demonstrate through tangible evidence, as opposed to just writing it down and memorizing, utilizing their rote memory. So are we giving space for this? Secondly, are we affirming the epistemic authority of students? Who are we calling on? Are we conscious of who we call on when we're asking questions? Are we conscious of how we respond to students' answers when we call and give them space? Right? Are we emphasizing the things that students do know as opposed to only focus on what they don't know when we're asking questions, right? So being intentional about, if we know students are struggling in a certain area, do we know them enough to identify their strengths and give them opportunity in the classroom to express what they do know about themselves or about society, right? And use it as a self-esteem builder to pull them into the stuff that they're not as strong and knowledgeable about, right? Or maybe using students collectively, ones that have different strengths, to work together to get a broader, right, group of knowledge. And lastly, are we cultivating epistemic responsibility? And so when students are, I just don't know, I'm not a math person, right? How are we helping them break through those problematic stereotypes and barriers about their beliefs to know something? Black people don't really know math. You know what I'm saying? Black people, we don't like to read. Like, those type of things may be explicitly or implicitly stated, because when we are elevating the knowers, they tend to look a certain way. So when you start bringing in, African history or indigenous history, not for the sake of, oh, look at this was the first person, that was the first person, but rather to highlight the fact that this is not an essentialist biological flaw that you have. There are some social barriers that may be disrupting or impacting your community, but this is not something that's always existed. That people of a darker hue or with a certain pigmentation and phenotype don't know something. Actually, it's been the reverse, right? That many different people of different cultures have contributed in various ways, but it is our educational system that has deemed certain groups' contributions as more excellent than others. So we have to help students in building the academic confidence to be knowers and recognize there's a lineage, right? But also there is an opportunity in the future to build and know, and not allow them to fall into the trap that they can't know and they don't have anything to offer. So we're almost there, y'all. This is the last section. Make it make sense. So there's a professor, Dr. Gregory Carr. He's at Howard University. He's a professor of Africana studies. Africana is so there's different types of versions or kind of terms of like black studies. Some folks want to recognize that blackness or black is a construct that was developed in the United States, even though there are folks of the similar hues and ethnic ancestry. So some folks call African American studies or Afro-American or Africana, which is to speak to all the folks of the African diaspora, right, more recent descendants of Africa. So Africana is to encompass all the kind of darker folks who are more recent migrants from or descendants of the African continent. And so he has a Africana Studies framework. One of the components of that framework is ways of knowing or systems of thought, right? This is a more simplified way of saying epistemology. So he says within that, this is passed down through ages. This category asks the question, what kinds of systems did African peoples develop to explain their existence? And how did they use those systems to address fundamental issues of living? So when I'm talking about epistemology, what I'll talk about next, like an Afrocentric or African epistemology, it's really looking at this question. What kind of systems did African peoples develop? Typically what is done is if folks want to look at a different culture, they look at the culture and leave it in the past. So there's a movie, that recently came out, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, right? So it talks about the Mayan history. So a lot of times people learn about that, like, oh, a long time ago, these people did these great things. All right, back to this. So did it stop? Were there any descendants? Did anybody build on these things? Similarly with the history of African countries or different African folks. It's like, well, back then, way back, you had this rich ruler, Mansa Musa, who did X, Y, and Z. And so it's almost as if we indirectly or unintentionally cut off the great ways of thinking and doing that other historical cultures have done. The United States is one of the youngest countries, in the world. Many other countries and continents and cultures have long existed. So how have these things morphed or continued? Do they still exist? So really this is about asking what kind of systems of thought do they have and how do they use their systems to address fundamental issues of living? So if we think about STEAM or STEM education, STEM education really, it pervades or permeates every aspect of our lives. But somehow in the classroom, it becomes a very minute, limited, and bounded thing. And so one of the things that prevents us from appreciating other cultures and perspectives is delineating what's STEM and what's not STEM. If you build a house that doesn't have a solar panel or very fancy technology around, the construction materials, is it still engineering? Was a problem solved? Was mechanical devices used? Like those things are really true and fundamental to engineering or science. But they don't look the way that they look in this country or in modern times, and we determine that they're not really STEM. Secondly, this is about making students aware that Africans develop their own systems of thinking about reality will allow them to ask how Africans in the U.S. or throughout the diaspora have retained elements of their African identities while adapting new experiences and cultures to the challenge of living. So this is just that next step, right? When you ask those questions of what kind of systems that they have, and you don't bound it, and you say it's passed through generations, now we can look at the descendants of those African peoples and say, well, how are they using those same similar things? And how have they modified and shifted? So there's a lot of things around that in dance. There's a lot of things around that in language. Anybody heard of African American Vernacular English or Ebonics? Right? A lot of folks argue that was from African peoples who were speaking different languages, who flipped it and made the white English standard of English their own. Right? And so when you don't recognize the intellectual work of those things, we're denying the epistemic responsibility of our students. Right? The epistemic contributions of our students when they engage in these continued traditions. So if you know, going back to that point, in STEM, and particularly engineering, I know I'm talking about engineering, but also in STEM, the way that we make sense of things is through logical positivism. Again, I know I'm throwing a lot of big words at y'all, so let me know if I was confused with that. But generally what it means is the belief that science and engineering work can be separated from messy social concerns. So again, I talked about earlier, right, that emphasis on the technical and neglecting the social. That's the first part. The second part is as long as proper scientific and engineering methods of inquiry and design are followed. So you can separate them long as you stick with the scientific approach to making sense of the world. Right, so it has very numbers and centers. It's all about rationale, a visible and tangible logic, right? Because that's where we get messy. A lot of people look at Europe and talk about like the Enlightenment, right? And the growth of rationality, the emphasis on rationality. Well, if you're not careful, it can make it seem as if other ways of thinking are irrational. But really what it's saying is some people engage in what can be tangibly seen through experimentation. Other folks engage in rationale through the metaphysical and engaging in spirituality. That's how they make sense of the world, right? And so a lot of folks are like, that sounds silly, or that don't make sense, right? We're talking about different spiritual groups or religious practices. But for a lot of folks actually out in the world, that's how they make sense of things. So in engineering sciences, it's developed a culture that says, no, this is the right way, through logical positivism. It says experimentation and scientific method and so on and so forth is the way that we make sense of this reality. All that other stuff is, if that helps you sleep well at night or be a nice person, that's good. But that's not knowledge. That's not real knowledge, right? And so we're going to look at an alternative way. So this is the last slide here, but it talks about an alternative way of making sense of things. What I encourage you all to think about, not necessarily today, but later, is what can happen if we bring in alternative epistemologies to make sense of STEM. Because if we look at other areas of study, in social studies, in the humanities, these things are already happening. But we don't just see this happening in STEM because that logical positivism has such a stronghold on how we engage in STEM education. So the Africana, what does it mean to bring in the Africana lens? First, that means censoring African people's experience and how to view like an African worldview. And by African, again, I'm using that more broadly, not just people on the African continent, but also the descendants. So how is this different? Well, often in the United States, as I said, when we're talking about the thinkers that we celebrate, they tend to be white and Eurocentric, right, from different European countries. So what we normally do, what is mainstream for the United States, is to censor white or European folks in their worldview, right? And so if you can have a different worldview, it's always viewed in relation or comparison to that mainstream worldview. So this is saying when you begin to see things from the lens of black folks, where is them engaged in their daily life? Now we can make space. I was talking with Stephanie earlier. She talks about this concept of ethno-dance, right? Centering other cultures and using dance as a way to make sense and interact with one another. Dance is critical in a lot of African cultures, right? It's not just an extracurricular activity or recreation. There are many rituals and traditions that are rooted in dance and physical movement, certain ways of communicating oral traditions, but also things like certain ways of presenting oneself in hair. So some of the kind of historical, or not historical, but more recent ways that people connect black culture with STEM is through like the flat iron. So, or the chemicals that folks use to put in their hair. So not just perms, but also the things that they use to take care of their hair and being healthy, right? So if we ignore how important things like, is that me? I'm out of time, so I'm gonna pick it up. But when we censor the student in their cultural realm and their everyday lives, we are then trying to see where's STEM in your world, as opposed to this is STEM and you gotta connect to this, right? So it's about flipping that. But also what we see is STEM has often been used to oppress. When you censor black folks' perspective in particular, we can think about, the origins of pseudoscience around racism, right? Folks were paid millions of dollars or thousands or millions to prove that black folks were inferior. Scientific racism, right? Or things like how many people know who Eli Whitney is? Right, so he's often recognized as like the most prominent or the original innovator in the United States. Well, how Eli Whitney got famous was he created the cotton gin, which mechanized the process for extracting seeds out of cotton. This was something that people who were actually picking cotton, the black folks, were doing, and he added a mechanical process to it and got rich. But it also extended the life of chattel slavery, right? And so we don't make these connections that the traditional ways of using technology have oppressed black folks. When we begin to censor spirituality, we ask the question, how does STEM innovation influence the interconnectedness of life? So again, connecting to that metaphysical, where it's not just about doing stuff and exploiting nature, but realizing that we have a relationship where everything that we do impacts something about human life. I was having this conversation with my daughters, because we were walking outside, and they were like picking flowers or pulling things out of the trees. And as a kid, it's cool, but I'm also trying to help them think more critically. Like, what happens when you pull that off the tree? When you pick that flower, right? And they got like handfuls, and so I don't want to take away their happiness from it. But I'm like, what if you just take one instead of like a whole hand? That's having an impact. We don't visually see that, but I realize that it's having an influence on our economy and our environment. And now we're dealing with things like climate change, right? So it gives us space to have those conversations. I'll zoom through this, but you can see this in the Egyptian pyramids and the use of triangles, which represents the Trinity of God as a God, Father, Son. I'm about to mix it up because they didn't follow that. But like triangles and like the four faces all have a deeper meaning than just trying to build some large monument, right? Same thing with George Washington Carver. He talked a lot about his spirituality and helping them discover all the uses of a peanut. And thirdly, when we bring in this Afrocentric paradigm, it allows us to explore ideals and ideologies of liberation. So first, who determines which problems are worth solving? Right, so when we look at like the engineering grand challenges, a lot of these are centered in places other than the United States. And so it causes students to think that, if I want to be a good engineer, a humane engineer, I have to help other people in less advantaged and privileged countries. But I'm solving problems for them as opposed to with them. But it also causes us to neglect the issues of disenfranchised communities right on this continent. Right? And so just think about that framing, it centers humanity. So these are just like one example. I could talk about, a different time further, but I need to end and pass my time. But this is just a quick example of when we bring in other epistemologies that help us engage in STEM education from a different lens. Thank you for your time.
Let's take some questions.
Okay, yeah, I got a little bit of time.
Well, I have about 10 questions, but I'll listen to the other.
Here's my email, so I'm happy to get on the chat.
I was waiting for other people,
Okay.
but I got all kind of questions.
Okay. Go ahead.
Well, given what you just said, the governor of Florida decided African American students shouldn't be studying their own and declared that they would not fund them and support it. So from that angle, even though we're in Illinois, my question is, do you think his behavior and others who will follow him could think that what you're talking about could be viewed as not the correct knowledge that should be shared? Because the governor and others have decided we should know our own history and our achievements, because that's the base who we are.
Yeah, so I recognize this is a recent issue, and I recognize the real feelings that can come from this. But my perspective is like, when has teaching Black history ever been celebrated in this country? Like honestly, you know what I mean? Like that's why we have, Carter G. Woodson was a prominent scholar who created, Black History Week, which became Black History Month. That's why you had these scholars, because that course that he's rejecting is called Advanced Placement, trying to create an AP credit. But there were a group of folks who created the Black Studies curriculum to begin with, right? So, and then even before this one, we had these recent false critiques of critical race theory. People were critiquing something that actually wasn't critical race theory. So I'm not trying to downplay the uproar, but I also think we have to look at a broader context and say this has never been something that was acceptable or celebrated, and yet it still persists. So there's a book called Fugitive Pedagogy by Jarvis Gibbons, and he talks about the history of Black educators and their ways of contradicting the educational norms about what can be taught and how to teach. So particularly in Black communities, there's always been a legacy, even before Black Studies was formalized, of elevating our community and our particular needs. And why I advocate for this in STEM is because now I think there's a shift where Black folks are not centering Black experience. That's seen as like less than. When I would argue we actually need Black folks and other folks to understand STEM through the lens of their community so they can solve those particular issues. That's why a lot of the supposed solutions aren't working for certain communities, because they're not rooted in that way of knowing. So I think that there's certainly a political concern. For some folks it can influence their job, but I also don't think there are ways to navigate if we are willing as educators to take up this approach and subvert those type of norms. But so that's my answer to that. But we can continue to talk further.
You touched on a whole bunch of stuff, but one thing that I wanted to get your insight on is you talked about how within our community we have this self-perception of, you know, we're not good enough, or black people aren't good in math, or what have you. And some of that, or I don't know the origin of it, it could be coming from the outside, but as an educator, when I have students who don't necessarily have that growth mindset, and they think that it is genetic, and it's coming from home. So when I try to talk to the parent, they're like, well, I've always been bad at math. Like, how do you, from within our own community, empower them in a way that they actually, outside of the outside resources, how do we fix it from within so that we have students that don't necessarily feel like it's genetic or that they can succeed in STEM?
Yeah, so to me, I think those are one and the same. It was something that started externally and then was taken up, right, throughout generations. So I think there's a couple things. One, I try to help folks. I try to sit there and language like, you're not bad at math. You didn't. That's why I differentiate education from school, right? The way in which you were taught was in a way that does not connect with you to help you understand the content. I think it's important, like, naming that for folks, because that is an initiation of a separation between you as a person and what you're capable of doing versus how you were trained in the school, and the bounds of school and limitations and things. So I think naming that, but I think also for the students in the classroom is using these historical contexts to say, how can you be bad at math if you descend from these people who actually originate a lot of how we think about math today? So you have things like ethnomathematics, but even just the simple dynamics of like the Egyptian pyramids and the origins of Pythagoras' theorem, that we give credit to Pythagoras and not the. So a lot of people use this as kind of like these kind of educational tricks to like, ooh, look, be excited. But I think we need to be more rooted in it to explain that STEM is not objective. A lot of this is socially constructed. And we have to figure out ways to engage with our students to help them understand that, so they depersonalize what they're experiencing, and become to develop some epistemic agency in their ability to engage. So we have to do some unlearning, help them unlearn some things that, but we don't normally have this conversation, so we have to initiate those.
All right, we need to wrap up.
Okay, yeah. Well,
So
thank
real
you.
quick question.
Oh, no, just a quick question. So a common refrain in this field is it's about the science, not the scientist. So I'm wondering how, it's in 30 seconds, when you're in a room with faculty or your colleagues, and somebody says, well, it's not about the scientist, it's about the science. How would you, what recommendations would you have?
Well, I'll simply say science don't do itself. You know, somebody is studying a thing and then transmitting knowledge. And so that's where the role of the scientist plays, is we can all extract data, but how we determine which processes are used, that's determined by scientists. How we determine, again, epistemic access, what processes are legitimate, that's a science community. But also how the narrative we tell about the usefulness of that science. It's supremely critical that the scientist is determining that. So just naming those human components for those people is what I would suggest.